Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Rocket Chiro Podcast. This is the business and marketing podcast for chiropractors. We're going to talk about what your options are as a chiropractor getting ready to start your career. This is, I think, what happens to a lot of chiropractors, and I would say that this has happened to me, and I know it's happened to a lot of chiropractors that I've worked with, or at least that I've spoken with, that you get into a little bit of a tunnel vision when you get ready to start your career. You graduate from chiropractic college, and generally, this podcast applies to those who are getting ready to graduate, those who have recently graduated, or chiropractors who are feeling a little bit stuck in your current situation and you're not exactly sure what your options are. So that is, and it doesn't really matter where you feel stuck. There are other ways of practicing chiropractic. And that's really the point of this. I'm not going to do a deep dive into each of these. I'm going to do an overview of six. Actually, I have 6.5 because the last one is not really, it's teaching, which is not really something I'm going to get into a lot. But there are 6 different ways of starting a practice or having a practice as a chiropractor. And I'm just going to give you a few pros and cons. And the point of this really is just to give you something to think about as you're deciding to start your career as a chiropractor, because you go to chiropractic college, you're a lot of times just focusing on tests, focusing on passing boards, getting that diploma. And then you get to that point where all of that stuff has happened and the rubber meets the road. You have to actually start your career as a chiropractor. And it can be a bit overwhelming, and chiropractors have a tendency to get laser focused on whatever they know and whatever they've been exposed to. So when I started my practice right out of school, and I started a solo practice. And so I never worked for anybody else. I hired staff person right away to answer the phone and kind of help me with some of that administrative stuff. And that's what I did, because in my brain, my only 2 options were to be an independent contractor or to be to just start my own practice. Like, those were the only 2 options. There are other options. I'm going to go through those and hopefully just open your eyes to the possibility, maybe even start you down a path of, oh, that's interesting. Let me look into that a little bit more. And you can do your own kind of research or deep dive into the potential of having that type of practice. Before I get too far into that, I do want to say, if you want help with business and marketing and you need more than just the podcast, check out my Next Step program. It's just a month-to-month program. It's access to marketing training, business training, access to me, and it just gives you a really great foundation, helps you become a small business owner, because if you're going to be a competent chiropractor and make a good career as a chiropractor, most likely there's going to be some small business skills that are going to be required, and those aren't taught in school. Not saying it's even the school's job, just saying that it's not taught in school, or if it was taught in school, you weren't listening. So Next Step is a great option. It's affordable. It's month to month. It's for chiropractors. Go to Rocket Chiro and check that out. If you want help with your website and SEO, or you're just getting started and you need a new website, go to Rocket Chiro and request a practice assessment. One of the things that is included with my websites just as of this year is the Next Step program. So you get a really nice bundle there if you want the Next Step program and a website. You can request a practice assessment. I'll take a look at your stuff. No obligation, no pressure, but I'd be glad to look at your stuff and see if there's something I can do to help you out. RocketChiro.com. That's where you get all that stuff. That's where you get the help. That's where you get the connections. All right, so here are our options. Here are our 6.5 options. Associate, number 1, associate. Number 2, independent contractor. Number 3, buying existing practice. Number 4, partnership. Number 5, starting your own solo practice. Number 6, a micro practice. And 6.5, becoming a teacher or researcher or whatever, working for the school. And that's something that a few of my classmates did. So I mentioned it because it is a possibility. There are people that don't want to really, they kind of decide that they don't want to be a chiropractor. They don't want to put their hands on people. They don't want to go through the headache of doing all that, but they love the profession and they like teaching. And so they, teach adjusting. They get into they could become a DAC bar or whatever. Like those are all options, working kind of the educational element. I'm not really going to talk about that any more than I just did, because that's not really the target market, my target person that I'm trying to talk to with this podcast. So let's kind of go through these really quick. Associate, I think, is really common, and that's obviously something that a lot of chiropractors know about. I would say the pros of an associateship is it's a learning opportunity, and there's some guaranteed income, or at least there should be some guaranteed income if you're an associate. Some people do get into really, really bad associate positions where they don't have any sort of guaranteed income, and they end up in a situation where it's all just percentage based. That sort of, I think, strips one of the positives of being an associate, because there are a lot of negatives of being an associate. I would say the two negatives that I would just highlight is bad working environment and low income. It's pretty unusual for associates to be happy with their associateship for a long period of time. Now, those things do happen. There are associates that I've met, there are associates that I know who are in positions that they've been in for a very long time. They're relatively happy with it, or as happy as they can be. And I don't mean that as associateships, it's impossible to be happy. I just mean that even if you have your own practice, it's not blissfully wonderful all the time. So there are downsides to everything. The thing about the associate that is sort of the bait and switch, I think, for a lot of people is that whole learning opportunity. And I use the word opportunity because a lot of chiropractors go into an associateship because they're relatively easy to find. They do have that typically low guaranteed income, but at least it's something. It's better than nothing if you're starting on your own. And they think to themselves, like, I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm going to become an associate and I'm going to learn what to do, and then I'm going to be better prepared. Generally, that's just not true. It just isn't. There are exceptions to that rule, but most of the time, you're not being taught the things that you think you need. You're not being taught the things that are going to be really important for you to have your own practice. I would also say this, is that if that's the intention with the associateship, meaning you want to become an associate because you feel like you need to learn some stuff, make sure that you're associating with the type of, be picky about the associateship, and don't just take a job because the job is available, because sort of the point of this podcast in general is that there are a lot of different ways of practicing. And if you take an associateship because you don't know what you're doing and because you want to be better prepared as a chiropractor, but you take that associateship with someone who doesn't practice anything like you want to practice, the potential of you becoming more competent in the area that you want to, when you're not in the environment that you want to be in, you're not trying to mirror this or copy this or do some of your own version of what you're learning. All it is a paycheck. And it's generally not a good paycheck. I would argue that most chiropractic associates would make more money if they quit and worked for Quick Trip, like the gas station down in the corner, and became a manager. I think that's generally true. There are some exceptions to that, but it's generally true. Now, I'm not crapping on associateships. There are really good opportunities, there are reasons to do it, et cetera, et cetera. It's better than nothing. Like, I understand. But don't let fear be the reason that you accept an associate position. And I think that fear is the primary reason that most chiropractors accept associate positions, versus doing something else. That's my own opinion. Take it for what it's worth. It's my podcast. I get to have my opinion, right? Next one we're going to talk about is independent contracting. When I got out of school, the only two things I was really aware of that I would seriously consider, I didn't consider being an associate. I think primarily because I was so into upper cervical, and I was so sure that that's what I was going to do. I sort of just viewed finding a practice that was going to allow me to do the type of upper cervical that I wanted to do and pay me as an associate. Like, I felt like I was going to look for a needle in a haystack. And so I just didn't do it. But the independent contracting was a possibility. My chiropractor would have let me independent contract out of his office, or I could start my own practice. Upsides of the independent contracting is generally you're looking at low risk. You also can be in a situation where you're sharing staff or sharing equipment. So for instance, if a lot of independent contractors are working with other chiropractors, now there are exceptions to that, but they're generally working with other chiropractors. If I were to take a job or take an independent contracting position with my chiropractor, then I would have had access to his staff at times when they are there. I would have had access to his x-ray equipment. I would have had access to, he has an extra table that's like the same kind of technique that I was using. He has an extra room. He had that stuff already. He had a office that was set up that could have had an independent contractor, and it would have been very little on my part that I would have had to contribute to that. It would have been a pretty decent situation in terms of low overhead and some nice perks. So depending on where you're independent contracting, if there's a lot of overlap with what you want to do and that chiropractor has some extra equipment, or they let you, you can use the staff while they're there or whatever, those are some perks to independent contracting. The downside of independent contracting is oftentimes it's a very questionable or not very favorable work dynamic. There are a lot of chiropractors that bring on independent contractors that do not leave you alone. And that is not a situation that you should be in. If you are an independent contractor, obviously there should be a structure to how that independent contracting works. There might be certain times or certain things you can do, not do, certain places you can go, certain rooms you can use and not use. Like, that's fine. Like, there should be rules. But once the rules are established and you've kind of agreed upon those rules, they shouldn't be micromanaging what you're doing. And I've talked to independent contractors that have some sort of weird fee structure. They are forced to, they can't have their own website. Like, they're on the main chiropractor's website or their leasing chiropractor's website. They have to wear the shirts and the logos of the existing practice, even though they're independent contracting, they're not an employee. Just, you're independently contracting. Like, this person should, once they've established some basic rules of how things are going to operate, they should be leaving you alone. And a lot of times that's, I wouldn't say a lot of times, it's not difficult or not unusual to find a chiropractor who has an independent contractor that they are meddling with. And that's obviously a negative part of independent contracting. Two other things that I would consider negatives of independent contracting, and there's more positives and negatives with both of these. So I'm not saying that I'm not pointing out the only positives and negatives. Bad contracts, meaning there are some independent contractors that get in some really, really bad fee structures. I would recommend that you get into a flat fee arrangement. If you're independent contracting, that you pay X amount of dollars per month. I wouldn't recommend paying a percentage. I think that's just sort of a recipe to not be in a good situation financially. Like, that only works out when you're broke, and the point is not to be broke. So I would do some sort of flat fee. There can be issues with rules and time and stuff like that. Like I said, there could be bad contracts, even non-competes with if somebody moves out, which is crazy. Like, you shouldn't have that situation as an independent contractor, but those things do happen. So just bad contracts can be part of it. Also, the other thing to take into consideration is if you're working out of another chiropractor's office, there can be an SEO conflict. It's not a huge deal, and it's actually not as big of a deal as it used to be. But I can say this, if the office you're working out of is killing it from an SEO standpoint, it's going to be hard for you to show up because you're going to overlap with that person with the same technique and the same, like, there's just an overlap there that creates a little bit of a problem for someone who is brand new. Not saying that's a reason not to do it, but it is something you need to be aware of if you're independent contracting out of another chiropractor's office. Now, if that chiropractor stinks at SEO and they're completely unaware of it, then you can destroy them in a relatively short period of time. But there is that issue. All right. So, associate, independent contractor, we talked about those two. Let's talk about buying an existing practice. So with the next two, buying an existing practice and partnerships, one of the issues you're going to have with those versus the other ones is they're harder to find. It's easier to find an associateship. It's easier to find independent contracting. You can obviously start your own practice. You can do micro practice. Like, those are, there's really no barrier of entry for some of that. But in terms of partnership or buying an existing practice, if that's really the route that you want to go, you got to find it. And that can be a very difficult thing. I've met many chiropractors who are just hell-bent on buying somebody else's practice. They don't want to start from scratch. They want to buy somebody else's practice. They're willing to accept the kind of negatives that come along with that, which is perfectly fine. Like, I'm not telling you what you should and shouldn't do, but they're hell-bent on doing it. And they also want to be in a certain area. So it's like, okay, if you want to be in a certain area or a basic area and you want to buy a practice, It's hard to find. That's all. It's hard to find. So let's kind of go through buying a practice. The upside is obviously going to be that there's an established patient base and established income, assuming that everything is above board and that the information they're giving you is legit. The practice is stable. There's no funny business going on. That's obviously something you need to be aware of. Downside is going to be cost. It's going to be way more expensive to buy somebody else's practice versus start your own, and in really any capacity. You do have the potential of patients leaving. I would generally tell any chiropractor that's buying a practice, expect on half the people to leave. And if they don't, consider that a bonus. So when you're negotiating price, you're talking about income, what you're expecting out of the business, I would expect half the people to leave. And if they don't, that's a bonus. And depending on how you transition, depending on how long the other doctor sticks around, depending on how you come in and they go out, all of those things are a factor. Also, depending on how attached people are to that particular chiropractor's personality or hands or whatever, all of that plays a factor, and it's going to be completely unique depending on the situation. That's why, as a general rule, I would just say expect half the people leave. This was something that when I talked to Dr. Johnson, the ring dinger, he had sold his practice, and he actually had gone back. He had transitioned the doctor to the new patients. That's such a unique situation because he is really the face of that whole operation, that whole thing. People come in, they want to see him. They don't see him. They see somebody else. There's people that have been there for a long time. Obviously, any of that can be really problematic. He actually went back. I haven't talked to him in a while, but he went back to help the doctor because the business was slowing down. But that's sort of expected. It really is. And if you don't expect that and you don't think that's going to happen, and if the doctor that's leaving doesn't care, which makes it worse, and kudos to Dr. Ringdinger, kudos to him for caring enough to go back and try to help the doctor and try to help kind of plug some of the holes in the ship. But that does happen. It happens a lot. So you have to be aware of that. There's also, last thing I would say is legacy issues. And what I mean by legacy issues is just there could be staff issues, billing issues, patient issues, reputation issues. Like if you want to really, before you buy a practice, you want to just investigate legacy issues. Like how disgruntled is the staff? Are there questionable billing practices? Are there disgruntled patients? Check the person's Google reviews, check the person's whatever. You ask around, what is the reputation of the practice? Because if you're buying someone's practice, and this does happen a lot too, and I wouldn't recommend that you do it unless the situation calls for it. I've heard of chiropractors that buy practices. I shouldn't say I've heard of them. I've met chiropractors who have bought practice and immediately changed the name of the practice. I don't think that that's smart. And the reason I don't think it's smart, hold on just a second here. I did this again last podcast. I didn't shut this off. Got it. The reason I don't think it's smart is because part of the benefit of buying somebody else's practice is buying the reputation of that practice. Now, if the practice has a bad reputation, then you should change the name, but you probably shouldn't also buy the practice, or at least not pay very much for it. If the practice has a good reputation and it has a bunch of established patients, changing the name of the practice so that people that haven't been in a little while don't know that it's a new name, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So I would recommend, even if you have a practice that has somebody else's name or has a name that you don't love or whatever, if you buy that practice, give it a year or two of you running the practice before you change the name. Just a thought. All right, partnerships. This one's pretty simple. I mean, they're hard to find. They always say if you want to ruin a friendship, go into business with them. I think there's a lot of truth to that. The upside is shared responsibility. A lot of people that don't want to carry the load of being the boss by themselves are interested in partnerships. You share the financial responsibility. You still get to be somewhat of the boss, sort of a half boss or a quarter boss, depending on how many partners there are. So there is perks from a shared responsibility standpoint, financially and authority and all of that stuff. Downside is conflict of vision. Too many people in charge, and generally speaking, there can be issues if depending on the personalities and stuff. I know that early in practice, one of my best friends, actually my best friend in chiropractic, we had kind of joked about we weren't going to start a practice together. We weren't going to go into practice together because we didn't want to ruin our friendship. I do actually think that at this point in my life and at this point in his life, if we did do a practice together, we could probably do it because we're both quite a bit more humble than we used to be. And we are much more secure in what we would do and what we would want, what we would not want. Our communication's better. In our 40s, I think it would be less of an issue than it would have been in our 20s. But that's sort of the deal, right? It just kind of depends on the situation. But conflict of vision, too many people in charge, like that can be an issue with partnerships, even if you do find one. Next is going to be solo practice. This is what I did. I started a practice. I did my own build out. I'm a surprisingly handy individual. So I found a space. I did my own build out. I started my practice. I had staff before I had a patient. Mainly, I'll tell you the reason why. I don't know that it was financially the smartest thing I've ever done, but the reason I had staff come in is because I'm so introverted. I hate answering the phone. I hate calling people back. Like I get so anxious about stuff like that. And especially when I was younger, it's not as bad now because I've just done it so much. But all of those things make me super anxious. And I knew that those things are going to be really important for having a practice. So I didn't want to self-sabotage. So I hired someone to do the stuff that I was not going to do very well and probably going to self-sabotage. So that's why I did it. I don't know that was financially the smartest thing I've ever done, but I did have staff before I had a patient. Solo practice. Upsides is you get to do it your way, right? It's I did it my way. That's one of the wonderful, beautiful things about starting your own practice. Income potential is amazing. You're not gonna. I don't think there's any way in chiropractic to have higher income potential than having your own practice with staff and whatnot. Like I think it's just probably the having your own traditional chiropractic practice is probably the best way, highest income potential. Downsides are going to be initial cost. The initial cost is high. I mean, you gotta buy everything. You gotta buy chairs for your waiting room. You gotta buy tables. You gotta buy therapy equipment. If you gotta buy your patient software, there's a lot of expenses. I did my overhead. I mean, it was I remember it was $20,000-$30,000 in build out, and I did it myself. Like it may not have been that much. I don't remember. It was expensive. It was very, very expensive to get open, and I had no patients. I didn't have one single patient, and I had already spent quite a bit of money getting started. So that is definitely the downside. Also, another downside is it can be really, really overwhelming from the standpoint of that you are the boss, you are the one in charge. There's nobody else really to lean on necessarily, and you have to do billing. You have to train people with billing. You have to do your different services. You have to train staff. Like you're the boss. It can be very overwhelming. There's so many things to do as a chiropractor, and you're starting kind of a bigger operation when you're doing a solo practice in the traditional sense. Last thing, and I would say this is the biggest downside of it, is just high risk. It is high risk, especially when you don't know what you're doing. Like you don't, and I don't mean you don't know what you're doing from all the stuff we already talked about. I just mean that you don't even necessarily know how you want to practice. And so that's the issue with this. Like when I did my own build out, bought my own equipment, all this other stuff, I had really forced myself down this path that I thought I wanted to go. Now I was fine with that path. Ultimately, I mean, there's practice change and variations a little bit. I mean, it kind of molded as time went on or morphed as time went on. But the reality is, if you decide like, I'm going to do this pediatric practice, I'm going to do this Gonstead practice, I'm going to do this sports injury practice, I'm going to do whatever, and then you spend all this money and effort and energy building out this business, you could obviously tweak it down the road, but you're spending a lot of money and energy and time and effort kind of going down this path to maybe find out you don't necessarily want to do it. So it is high risk. It's not necessarily something I would recommend. And in hindsight, if I had to do it over again, I would not do that. I just wouldn't. I don't think it was the smartest thing for me to do financially or career-wise or anything else. All right. Number 6. Last one we're going to talk about, micro practice. I've done podcasts about the micro practice. I'm a big fan. What I would define a micro practice is as technically you could be independent contracting as a micro practice. There's some overlap. There's a Venn diagram somewhere where there's a lot of overlap with independent contracting and micro practice and solo practice and micro practice. Like there's some overlap with these. What I would consider micro practice is generally you're looking at 1 or 2 rooms. You're looking at no staff, most likely. Many of them are cash practices. Some of them are insurance, but the doctor's pretty much doing everything themselves and then obviously delegating with perhaps software or outside services. I mean, there are some micro practices that have billing services through their software, their software company or something like that. But they're delegating. There's nobody there except for the chiropractor, and they generally have their 1 or 2 rooms. Benefit of it, which is why I recommend it a lot of times for new chiropractors, is it's the opposite of the solo practice in the sense that it's low risk. When you're leasing a room, one room, a closet, a room out of a gym, whatever, it's just low risk. It's generally low overhead, low risk. You have the potential for a high net profit. The chiropractors that I have worked with personally who have gone from making no money to their head above water, and they're actually starting to make some progress financially in their life. The ones who have done that the quickest have all ran micro practices. They've all done it that way. And I can say there are people who have still made those transitions and made those, growth points, but the ones who've done it quickest, the fastest, micro practice. It's without a doubt. That's why I recommend it. I'd also say it's less complicated. So in the sense that the solo practice can be overwhelming, obviously starting a micro practice can be overwhelming as well, but it's just less overwhelming because you can make it much more simple. Like you can simplify things. You should simplify things with a micro practice as much as humanly possible. So I think they tend to be less complicated than starting your own practice with staff. You get the building, you do the lease, you do all the stuff, you do everything. You're just doing less. It's managing less. It's the difference between owning a house with a bunch of land and whatever versus owning an apartment or renting an apartment. Like it's just less. It's less complicated. I would say the downsides are this. It's humbling. You got to humble yourself doing micro practice. You just do. Now, I don't think it's humiliating. I should clarify that. I think you can have a micro practice for your entire career, be a very competent, very well looked upon chiropractor. This is boutique chiropractic. It can be amazing. I know some micro practices that are incredible and they've been that way for a long time. So I'm not saying that it is humiliating to do. But when you're in chiropractic college and you get these ideas of what it means to be a chiropractor and you think to yourself, like, I'm going to have all this staff and multiple locations, multiple buildings, blah, 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 whatever. Like you're going to do all of this stuff. And then you say, well, I'm going to rent a room out of a gym. I'm going to rent a closet, out of another chiropractor's office or whatever. You have to humble yourself and get over it. Like get over yourself when a person comes in and not be weird about it. And one of the things I've said a lot on this podcast is things are only weird when you make them weird. And so, within reason, obviously, but when you have a normal and it's like, this is normal, this is how it is, it's perfectly fine for you to be a brand new chiropractor or even a chiropractor that's been out for 10 years and keeping things simple. It just is fine. And the people that care aren't your patients. They just aren't. And it's fine. You don't have to be everyone's chiropractor. Not everybody has to be a perfect fit for your practice. So it is humbling. And I will tell you, the number one reason I would have not considered this when I first got out of chiropractic college is because I was too darn proud. I was going to see 300 patient visits a week. I'm going to be a millionaire. I'm going to be amazing. I'm going to be the greatest chiropractor since whoever, whatever. I was too darn proud. So I wouldn't have done this when I was 24 years old because I was too proud. So that's why I say it's humbling. Now I would have no problem with it because I'm not a big deal. I'm not nearly as awesome as I used to be. So downside of micro practice, it's humbling. Downside is there's no staff, so you have to do it all yourself. So there is a certain amount of doing it yourself that you have to do versus if you had staff, maybe, calling people back or texting them back or whatever. Like ideally you minimize this as much as possible, especially with software now. You can minimize a lot of this that wasn't even available when I graduated. So, but you do have to do it all yourself. Like it really weighs on you unless you delegate it out to somebody else. I would also say the negative is there's a gross income potential that is not there with a micro practice. Now I say gross income, not net income, because I do think that you can run a micro practice and have a net income that is pretty darn close to chiropractors who have a much larger gross income. Like some chiropractors will really be like, I want $1 million practice, $1 million practice. I don't care what your gross income is. I really don't. I used to, because like I said, I was really proud of myself and I had big ideas. But I remember talking to a guy that I knew. He graduated a little bit after I did, and he had a couple chiropractors working for him. He had a big facility, and I was always super impressed, a little bit jealous. And he's a nice guy, so I wasn't hating on him for being successful, but I was a little jealous because I was like, man, this guy's killing it, and I'm not doing as well. And he was bringing in close to $1 million a year. It was a little bit less than that, but close to $1 million a year. And I just thought, man, I'm a slacker. Like I'm doing nothing. And when I sat down and talked to him one time, we went and had lunch, and I don't normally talk finances with people, but like I said, he was more of a friend than anything else. And we were just sitting and talking, and he starts talking about overhead and expenses and whatever. And as he got talking, he wasn't making that much more money than I was when it was all said and done. A few $1,000s, but it was less than $5,000. I mean, he's making less than $5,000 a month more than I was. And I would have never guessed that. But my practice didn't have the overhead that his. I didn't have the staff. I didn't have the building. I didn't have anything that he had. And so one of the downsides of micro practice is if you want that high number, you want to go around to your seminar and tell everybody you have $1 million practice. Well, I don't know, probably not going to be able to do that with a micro practice. But I don't think that really matters. I mean, to me, there's a contest that I will not reference, but sometimes chiropractors, they like to see who's got the biggest, income. So those are your options. You just finished up chiropractic college, or you're just getting ready to, or you're feeling stuck. And this is why I said if you're feeling stuck, because if you're an associate and you're feeling stuck and you're going, I don't have any other options, because I've talked to chiropractors like this, that they're so laser focused on the only way they know how to do practice that they're thinking, well, I'm an associate because I can't afford to open my own practice the only way that I know how. It's like, wait a second. You could independent contract with somebody else. You could start a micro practice. There are other options. And so the point of this podcast is just to open your eyes to, there's a lot of different ways to be a chiropractor. There's a lot of different ways to get started. There's a lot of different ways to exist as a chiropractor. You could do any of these for a long time if you want to. You find the right situation. You want to be an associate for 30 years. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And don't let somebody else dictate your chiropractic future. And I do think this happens a lot in chiropractic, where the techniques we do, the stuff we think is okay and not okay and whatever, we look around at the people nearest us or the chiropractors closest to us or whatever, and we worry about what other chiropractors are going to think. We worry about what they say. We worry about what the public... Just stop it. It's your career. You did this because you want to help people and you want to make a good living. There's lots of ways to help people make a good living as a chiropractor. Here's just a few of them, and hopefully it helps give you clarity and just gets the wheels turning in terms of what are your possibilities, what is possibly a next step that you could take to get your career going and get your career to the level that you want to as a chiropractor. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to leave the review for Rocket Chiro, you can go to Rocket Chiro and click on the Review Us button that's in the main menu. If you want some help, request a practice assessment. I'll look at your website and SEO, or you can join Next Step. Those are the two ways that I will be able to help you the most. I'm done. I'm out of here. I'll talk to you guys on the next episode. See ya.